Thank you for joining us this afternoon. In recent years, cyber attacks against cities have become increasingly common and incredibly damaging. A cyber attack can cripple cities' services and cause incredible costly damage, both against cities, large and small. While attacks against the largest cities receive the greatest headlines, cities of all sizes are at the greatest risk and frequently the most vulnerable. What can cities do to protect themselves from emerging cyber threats? How can we better protect ourselves as citizens and as a community and as a country? Today, we have a multi-stakeholder panel of some of our leading experts to discuss the ways in which cities can better prepare themselves to take on the cyber threats of both today, tomorrow, and beyond. I'd like to introduce Kiersten Todt, the Executive Director of the Cyber Readiness Institute, Simon Hunt, the Executive Vice President, Cybersecurity at Mastercard and a leading expert on cyber solutions, and Munish Walther-Puri, the Director of Cyber Defense for the City of New York. I think you all will enjoy a fantastic discussion and a robust panel today. I'd like to start with Kiersten around the threat environment that we've spoken about before. How has the cybersecurity threat environment for cities changed in recent years from your experience?
Thank you, Alex, and thanks for the opportunity to be a part of this panel, and I certainly look forward to the discussion. I think we don't even have to look farther than the last couple of years as we look at the interdependencies of the digital economy, and particularly looking at what's happened with the pandemic and the urgency that small businesses felt to go online. What we're seeing in cities are small businesses becoming more vulnerable to cyber attacks because they're not prepared for them. And so as we look at ransomware in particular, we've seen that ransomware as a business model across cities and small businesses has become very lucrative for the malicious actors because they don't need to ask for a lot. And so they'll get the money that they need, but what it does to small businesses is crippling. And one of the things that we've been studying more recently at the Cyber Readiness Institute has been the recovery of small businesses. Mastercard did a study that talked about 6 months after a breach, most small businesses, 64% of small businesses go out of business. And when we look at the average cost of a breach for a small business being $4 million, we can see the economic stress that these businesses are experiencing. And small businesses are what make up state and local communities. They're what make up our cities. And we have to be doing a better job helping them build defenses that are resilient so that they can ensure that they can deliver the services that are required from them and that they are strong enough to handle attacks. Because as we know, it's not so much about preventing attacks, but it's how you can respond and recover once you've been breached.
It's so spot on, Kiersten. And I think, so many of these cyber attacks continue to take advantage of systemic weakest links. And what I'd be really interested is your thinking around where some of those weakest links are and how we can help businesses in our cities, more specifically, ensure that the weakest links become less vulnerable, especially at a moment in time when so many of our businesses, particularly small businesses, are working to recover from COVID and build their businesses back out.
Well, you hit on an important point, Alex, because as I talked about, the interdependencies mean that our supply chains now really bring in every business into it. It's no longer a small business on the corner is not connected to a larger business. We see the interconnectedness of our supply chains. And so the weakest link is often small businesses. And one of the studies that we've worked on and have been a part of with one of our members with the Cyber Readiness Institute talks about the fact that it's not that small businesses aren't willing to spend the money. They often just don't know what they need to do or that they have a responsibility. And that's not negligence, it's about knowledge and education. So if you think about cybersecurity as being a line item in budgets just in recent memory within the last 10 years or so, and you've got small businesses that are restrained in resources, when you add something as significant as cybersecurity to their budget and to their requirements, it puts a strain and it creates vulnerabilities within that enterprise, within that small business. So again, we have an opportunity to work with state and local governments as well as the federal government to get into our cities and to help these small businesses know what the basics are. It doesn't require a huge financial investment as a starting point, but doing the basics where every employee can be a force multiplier for security within these small businesses across cities.
So Kiersten, to that end, let's talk a little bit about some of that force multiplier and what some of those basics are. I think that's an area that's incredibly ripe and often overlooked. To your point, frequently these are areas that are could often be some of the most approachable, but often the issue of cybersecurity feels like it is often unapproachable. What are some of those top areas that you would focus in on as the basics that you can lean in on for our small businesses to really take away from today?
So the Cyber Readiness Institute was founded on the idea that small businesses don't have the resources to invest significantly in cybersecurity. And so in light of that, what are the approaches and the strategies and the actions that small businesses can take? And in doing so, we focus on human behavior. And the good news there is that the issues that focus on human behavior really give small businesses and all businesses basically an 80% foundation of security. And specifically, we look at authentication, the strength of authentication, and guiding small businesses to use a 15-character passphrase or more, looking at phishing education to help every individual within a company understand that he or she can be the access point for a malicious actor, but similarly can be a point of resilience for the company. As software updates, creating policies within an organization that say, don't linger on the note that tells you to update and wait 2, 3, 4 days. Helping small businesses understand what a software update is. It's a patch on a hole. And just like a boat, if you saw a hole in your boat, you'd want to patch it quickly. And then we have a policy now on USB use, which is essentially you shouldn't be using USBs. And we're in the process of developing additional content on what it means to go to the cloud and cloud-based file storage. The idea being here that you can have a strong, resilient organization with an educated workforce. Human behavior is often identified as our greatest vulnerability, but educated employees, informed employees can be the greatest strength and cyber defense for a small business.
That's fantastic advice. And I'd encourage folks to continue to look at the cyberreadinessinstitute.org and the work that is ongoing there. Munish, I think Kiersten led on to an interesting segue as it relates to infrastructure and the resources that cities have. In particular, this paradigm and sort of paradoxical situation of often a view that sunk costs around protecting systems and infrastructure versus updating and creating the newest systems, capabilities, and technology. Who's more likely to be at risk? Systems that are outdated with legacy infrastructure or some of our new emerging technologies? This is often a challenging paradigm, so I'd love to hear from a leading expert like you of how you approach this type of an issue.
Yeah, that's a good frame. So thank you for the question, Alex. Thanks for the opportunity. Thank you also for the promotion of the Director of Cyber Risk. And I think about defense, but I have a lot of colleagues that work on that. At the core of your question is this trade-off. And Kiersten brought up a very practical example, USB versus moving to the cloud. Anyone who understands about cloud infrastructure can recognize that there's risks and vulnerabilities there as well. So how do you make that decision? Well, the first is to recognize that you're making a decision around trade-offs and around risk. And to me, the way I think about it and talk to my team about it, risk management, to include cyber risk management, is about resource allocation. Where are you going to put your resources? And so if we think about a legacy system versus technology that is leading edge, and in some cases bleeding edge, there's vulnerabilities in both. Where do you put your resources? It's a bit of a false dichotomy to say one or the other. There are cases to be made for both. And I'm never satisfied when someone says it depends, so I won't say it depends. I'll say you need to figure it out. And one of the ways, there isn't a single way, but one of the ways to figure out, it really comes fundamentally down to understanding your assets, your environment, and building in this sense that the organization is making a risk decision. So I really like Kiersten's framing that it's about culture. You know, even if you understand a thing, if you can't get people to change their behavior, and more importantly, sustain that behavior change after you leave, that risk reappears. And so every city employee, in a sense, is making a risk decision for their agency, and in some cases, for the city writ large. And it's our job to educate, inform, and support the agencies to let them know that their employees have that level of agency themselves and power. The other part of it is we want to enable our agencies to have greater reliability, efficiency, scale, and that means deploying cutting edge technology. So how do we deploy at speed? Because our adversaries would love nothing more than for us to do it too fast. That's great. They love it. So how do we keep up the speed and maintain security? And I think one of the greatest forms of risk reduction is building relationships. You really have to have those relationships to be in the conversation. You can create process, absolutely. But what's going to let you know when something's outside that process, which we're in the space where sometimes it is, are the relationships. For someone to come and say, hey, we're thinking about this new technology. What do you think? And you get a chance to say, thank you for asking me. Here's what I think.
It's so incredibly important, right? To create an environment where, both to your earlier piece of a culture that allows individuals within a huge city, the largest city in the United States, and around the world, one of the largest cities, to have a culture that feels both empowered, but also the balanced approach where, as in your role, to have a degree of prescriptive elements where there are certain needs there. And I think creating that baseline culture as the start point is so important. And you hit at that so nicely. Moreover, your last piece on how we create an environment where individuals can be creative, to have that agency, big and small a, capability in and of themselves, to feel empowered to take the appropriate risks to serve citizens around the country, around the city, is an incredibly important point. It's the fundamental role of governments, is to serve our citizens, right? And so to create that environment where you both reduce risk, but also enable innovative capabilities, innovative citizen-facing services and resources, is such a powerful mandate, and often one of the hardest to achieve. So personally, as a citizen of New York, I personally appreciate it. But moreover, I also think it's one that is emblematic of the dichotomy and the challenge that individuals in your role and cities often face. What I'd like to move forward to from your perspective is how you build out a cyber strategy. I set you up with a nice compliment purposely, so that I now want to hear about your entire strategy for the city of New York.
Yeah, that's a big question. The first thing I'll say is that we have a division committed to strategy. So that should tell you how important it is. It isn't just an idea. There's a whole division, a group, where our policies group is in there, the cyber risk team, our education awareness and training, our strategic planning teams, all comprise that strategy division. So the first is, allocate some resources towards strategy. I know that might sound patently obvious, but I think that's the starting point. That's the precursor. The way I think about it, in what we've done, there's three components: maturity, capacity, visibility. And they're not necessarily in this particular order. They work together, this trifecta: maturity, capacity, visibility. So around maturity is, and people who work in security understand that you need to assess where you are. Just establishing a baseline of the maturity of the various organizations is really important. There are some things that we can say for any agency. Here are 3 things you need to do. So that's pretty clear. The question is, what happens when you get to number 4 and 5 and 6? Where should they put their effort? And we can bring forward some great ideas, but they might need resource help. That's fine. We need to understand that. So one part is maturity. Second, related to that, capacity. What is the agency's capacity to execute on these various efforts? Again, we can hurl at them a list of 10 things to do, but then we're asking them to try and trade off which ones they should work on. And that can be a problem where it's the tyranny of the urgent. And we really want to support them in being able to prioritize effectively and see progress. Nothing is more frustrating than feeling like you're working on a bunch of things and not making progress. So that's the capacity part of it. The third is visibility. It's a bit of an aphorism and trite even in security, but you can't defend what you can't see. And that also gets to a core component of inventory of assets, that very basic thing that it's nearly impossible to manage risk without doing that. And so getting that visibility also allows us to build out the digital fortress. And we're really focused on that from an endpoint protection standpoint. But these three together, and I would put what's at the center of that strategy, being able to tell the story. Why? Again, you can tell people what and how, but they have to understand and really internalize the why to sustain that behavior change after you leave the meeting, after you sign off, after you're not there. So those three components really comprise the key elements of our strategy.
I think that's incredibly salient and spot on. I'd maybe even challenge us to go a step further. That's about our agencies, but as you and I have discussed in prior conversations, the ability of governments to provide trust in the resources as citizen-facing capabilities is even more pronounced. These are some of the most public-facing entities, whether it's the parking authority on over to our tax revenue systems, on over to our police department. The capacity for our cities to imbue that trust in the citizens that elect public servants, but also the government officials that are there and work there for years. How do you think about driving that, especially in a moment in time as issues of ransomware, disinformation, and the broader set of challenges that we're all facing, both as companies, individual citizens, and governments continue to face?
Yeah, it's something that I think a lot about. Before the pandemic, when we thought about, and we needed to think about what are the most critical services and what are all the services, not just the most critical, what are the critical services and all the services that the city delivers via its agencies. What does it mean if we weren't able to deliver some of those services? That was hard to imagine even for the most creative. And it was definitely hard for other people to imagine. And then the pandemic happened and we saw what that might look like. We saw what it meant to stop being able to deliver services the way we thought we'd be able to deliver them. And we also saw—
It's startling, right? I mean, it's startling.
It was really a test of trust. It really was a test of trust because there was no benchmark. There was no baseline against which people could compare to see how did you do the last time. This wasn't a natural disaster or anything like that, where unfortunately all cities have experienced that before. So this was a new kind of moment. And the trust was the ability to move quickly, continue to scale, communicate, and do all of that securely. That comes back to that core elements that we had. We think a lot about trust at Cyber Command. There's an equation that we use internally. It comes from the head of NYC3, the citywide CISO for the city of New York, Jeff Brown. Facts plus judgment plus culture equals trust. We have to get our facts right. We need to be able to use judgment that people can rely on, a culture of honest intellectual debate, and that leads to trust. One of the early on when I joined Cyber Command, I asked myself a question, having come from private sector and work a lot with that community. How do you measure the reduction or the impact? How do you measure the reduction of cyber risk? How do you measure the impact of risk in an environment where revenue is present but isn't the only factor? Right, in the private sector, you can say, what hit is that going to take to our shareholders? There can be regulatory liens, judgments, fines, something like that. But with the city environment, it's the ability to deliver that service. What is that erosion? How do you measure the erosion of trust? And to that, there's a lot that you have to deal with that isn't within your purview. Third party, I don't want to open the third party can of worms, but here we go. Third party issues, not your problem, definitely your fault. So other way around, sorry, not your fault, definitely your problem. You have to deal with those, and all institutions affect that. But the last thing I'll say, and I would love to have a conversation about this actually, is we think a lot about the relationship between our third parties and suppliers to the city, resiliency and cyber resiliency, and the connection between those two. We have the vision to be the most cyber resilient city in the world. And that resilience comes from being able to both move quickly and recover and withstand and adapt. So there's a lot there, I think, to unpack, but it's something we think can act on every day.
I think that's incredibly salient again. And I think that resiliency piece is one that whether it's a small business, whether it's the largest city in the United States, that we all need to continue to think about and focus in on, because at the end of the day, that trust in our services, whether it is the mom and pop shop and delivering food to that family, or it's the city of New York, we're going to need that capability and understanding, because events do happen. Resilience deeply matters. And having that trust in the individuals, the agency, as you spoke to a moment ago, in individuals to be empowered, and also the capacity to address threats as they happen. Thank you. It's a really, really thoughtful set of points there. I want to bring in Simon Hunt, who's one of my colleagues at Mastercard, to speak to the collaborative actions that we're thinking about and the broader picture, particularly around the amount and severity of cyber attacks against cities. Simon, you've seen so many of these events happen over your years. Can you talk to what you're thinking about and seeing on the broader picture of these attacks?
Yeah, so it's it's hundreds of attacks, hundreds of successful reported attacks a year at the moment, and they're just the reported ones. We know most countries in the world don't have the rigorous reporting infrastructure we have here in the US and in Europe, so attacks go unreported and unnoticed. But it's highly lucrative for the criminals. This year, millions of dollars have been paid by cities to criminals to recover from ransoms. Last year, it was tens of millions of dollars. So we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. So we know the problem is huge. What makes it particularly upsetting is these are not attacks initiated by criminals who have decided, let's attack New York today. It's not that sophisticated. It's automated systems that trawl the internet to find victims. And then those victims are sold to other criminals who exploit them and monetize them. Nobody cares that it's a city or not a city. It's just, are you victim? Are you able to be a victim or not? So the social impact, the evil and the disarray that these create, criminals, they don't care, or they don't seem to. There has been some talk recently. The Colonial Pipeline attack on America was. The attack itself wasn't particularly devastating, but the societal reaction to the fear of not being able to buy gas was intense and devastating to communities along the East Coast. I mean, people were fearful that they would not be able to get to work, and they went on to extreme behaviors to buy gas, which caused gas shortages and caused even more unrest from a relatively simple attack. That created a lot of friction in government circles, because we know the attackers were in Russia. We don't believe they were Russian state actors. They just happened to be physically located in Russia. But the fact that the Russian government didn't seem to act robustly against them has caused huge tension within our government systems now. So much so that particular criminal gang has disappeared, evaporated. One of the rules seems to be, don't upset our neighbors or don't upset the US government because the heat's too hot. That's not a defense that we can rely on to protect our cities here. We can't rely on the fear of repercussions at the government level at the moment. So I think the attacks will continue. What I am finding interesting is there's several pieces of legislation going through various state senates and courts in the states that forbids the use of public money to pay ransoms. And if you think about that, it's a law that says the state can't use public money to pay criminals, which you would think would already exist, but it doesn't. But I don't believe that a law prohibiting a payment will discourage the criminals. I don't think they're that sophisticated and that they are using that as a metric as to who they attack. they will attack nonetheless. If you don't pay, they just move on. They imparted no effort to cause the damage. So why would they bother being sophisticated about the response?
Right, they already have the asymmetric advantage against the victim. And so it is inherently not in their advantage to worry about that problem, especially
at the moment.
Right.
Yeah.
And so, so exactly. So how are you thinking about that issue, specifically the paying of ransom? So let's just put a fine point on it.
Well, in particular, I'm interested in the cities themselves, and the US Conference of Mayors in 2019 was categorical in their statement that they would not pay ransoms. And I know a few mayors have acquiesced on that and had to claw back, but generally the US Council of Mayors have agreed that this is a socially unacceptable thing. It inspires the criminals to continue. It funds future attacks. It's inherently bad for everyone. So I hate the idea that we require regulation and legislation to prevent the payment of ransoms. And I also have such empathy for the victims and the cities who have been attacked. I have such huge empathy, but I don't believe that paying a ransom to solve your problem is justifiable when you know that it encourages the criminal to attack somebody else downstream. It's like pushing the problem forward to the weakest link, to the cities who are less able to protect themselves. So I'm pretty firm on don't pay the ransom unless there is imminent life or death situations. And I think the choice to pay a ransom or not lies with law enforcement, not with citizens. The decision to pay a criminal to solve a problem should be something done with law enforcement involved, very much so, in my opinion. But with all that said, I have tremendous empathy with the victims. I know that in my city, if there was a ransomware attack, I would call the mayor and say, what do you need? Like, how can I help you survive this without paying the ransom? What can we do to help you? And I would be loud and vocal of supporting a mayor who stood up and said, I'm not going to pay, as many mayors have done, actually. Many mayors have said, not going to pay, we'll get through this together. I would be a firm supporter of that person, and I would encourage other people to do the same, because paying encourages further attacks. A long answer to a short question, perhaps.
No, it's exactly the point of the group. Kiersten, look, I want to bring you in for a moment. You represent some of the most vulnerable, our small businesses. How are you thinking about the payments around ransomware and approaching that, particularly for small businesses? And I think there are strong similarities to the types of small businesses that we're speaking about and some of the smaller mid-sized cities around the country and the world.
Absolutely. And I think Simon's points, he really hit on all the tension, which is why this is a very challenging issue. I think as we look at whether or not to pay ransom, certainly the destination is for us to get to a point as a nation, as a world, where we're not paying ransom. There's no question. I don't think anyone can argue with that. Where we find ourselves in this challenging point is those businesses that are delivering critical services that haven't done the basics and are then being pressed. I think I very much am aligned with what Simon was saying about the psychological impact of Colonial. It wasn't that they weren't going to get the gas, but people created that fear. And if we actually look at how that all started, it was Colonial not using multi-factor authentication. It was their bill payment system that got stuck, and they were worried about not getting paid. And that's how their IT and their OT came together. So when we look at ransom, for small businesses and for state and local governments, we really want to make sure that we're helping these entities do the basics and know what it means to prevent ransomware. It's about preventing access to the networks, et cetera. But I think the point that Simon made toward the end is the critical one. If you are delivering viable services, if you are a state and local government, a city, a small business, you shouldn't be doing this on your own. Because when we create that dark market of ransom payments just to stay alive, we do facilitate a business, a lucrative business that has no consequences. And so the key here is, I think, when you are in a position where you've been caught, you've been affected by a ransom payment, the ability to work immediately and collaboratively with government officials, with law enforcement, to make a decision quickly. And to the point about, Mayor saying, we're going to get through this, We need to have that type of support for small businesses so that they don't feel that they're on their own, so that they do have that network of how are we going to get through this? What are the first things that you need to do? One of the things that we find all the time with small businesses is when they have an attack or ransomware, they don't know where to go to first. They think about their IT providers. Do they go to law enforcement? I think there are things that our federal government can do, as well as state and local governments, that just basically lay out a roadmap. When something happens, here are the steps that you need to take. But for those businesses and the state and local governments to know that they are not doing this alone, because in order to mitigate these types of events and to start to deter them, we've got to be able to prevent them and work together. And importantly, we have to prosecute the criminals, because as long as these criminals go forward without consequences, this will continue to be the most lucrative business model in the world.
I think that's so spot on. Maybe I'd move us away from having to pay the ransoms and thinking about our collective defense. And Munish, I love your insights and thoughts, particularly over the last week. The city of New York and the district attorney's office has announced a long fought and I think really impressive effort around critical services and infrastructure, and how businesses and the government can come together to support a city like the city of New York in defending against attacks and responding to it. I think this speaks to a broader value set and a belief set in how we all are in this together. I'd love your perspective on that issue, and also how you're thinking about it specifically at Cyber Command.
Sure. So yeah, that was that announcement was last week. So it's called the Cyber Critical Services Infrastructure Initiative, Ccsi. It's been
I
around.
thought I'd let you describe it and say its name instead of me.
Yeah, no, that's okay. It's a bit of a mouthful, but it's been around for a couple of years actually, although virtual, with these District Attorney's Office, NYPD, Cyber Command, and the Global Cyber Alliance. And what we've found is that those partnerships are obviously invaluable, but it really was operationalizing them, building them out, and extending to the different parts of critical services and infrastructure. And that extra word in there, services, gets that to that point I was talking about earlier, about the orientation of service delivery. And one of the things that can happen when we talk about critical infrastructure, I mean, really any topic, if you talk about it enough, that the phrase sort of loses its meaning. But that was, to interrupt that idea a bit and say, what are the critical services that we are providing, that we have governance over, and that we need to build partnerships to manage? If you think about the 16 critical infrastructure sectors, and DHS also has the national critical functions, which are kind of like the rows and the columns, so to speak, of how to think about it. That really gives us a robust picture of where we want to and need to strengthen partnerships, because it has to require everyone to do that. I would almost say, when we think about collective defense, I would put the burden on someone who would say, I'm just going to defend by myself. Like, I would flip it around. Say, why would you do that? Why should you make the case that you should defend just yourself and just by yourself? The ISACs are a really good example of this. Businesses ostensibly that are competing with each other have come together and are sharing intelligence regularly for the collective defense of that industry and bolstering that industry. And we've seen that across a number of different areas. And so that's really what it's about, is bringing that partnership together and focused around the city. So there is an operational component, and then there's a number of partners that can and will and have been supporting in how we share intelligence and operationalize our collective defense and response.
So to your, I could not agree more strongly. The idea that you're going to protect yourself alone and that you're more powerful in doing so is completely foolhardy, especially as we think about issues of cross-border data and the capacity in cities, states, globally, to allow companies, citizens, and businesses to defend one another, flipping it, that asymmetric issue of the cyber threat actors who have the inherent advantage of just going after entities time and time again. It's time that we start thinking about it in the reverse. And so I think it's especially powerful that we're in this together. I'd love to hear Simon's thoughts a bit about how the private sector can also contribute to this a bit further.
Well, I think it comes back to what Kiersten was saying about education. The greatest weakness we have is ourselves. The criminals are hugely successful at capitalizing on failings of of people not understanding that they are an integral part of the cybersecurity ecosystem. Just using strong passwords, using unique passwords, and updating your systems when the systems need updating, that's like most of the battle at the moment. And unfortunately, we have an industry who sells a lot of fear. The cybersecurity industry, of which I am a participant in, I should say, often encourages people to think about the most exotic, latest, greatest, most complicated attacks. They're the ones that are cool and notable. When in reality, stop using the same password everywhere is the best advice I can give anyone. That solves so many problems. So many attacks, criminals walk in with a user ID and password, and they didn't guess it, they downloaded it. And it's as simple as that. So our industry needs to teach people that sharing information, sharing your successes and your failures isn't a competitive story. And as you mentioned, Ron Green, our CISO in Mastercard, speaks to all the CISOs of all the other networks and the banks. We share things, we willingly discuss. We don't consider it a competitive advantage to be more cyber secure than our peers. We want them to be as secure. And to take that to the next stage, it comes to our supply chain, the vendors that we all do business with. I don't want my lawn guy to have a cybersecurity incident because he has details on me and my family. I want to protect him.
He knows the dirty secrets that you never cut your lawn.
He knows when I'm on vacation. That's very interesting information. But that's just me personally. As a company, we want all our vendors to be secure. And anything we can do to help people be more secure, and to be more secure is easy to say. Let's help them reduce their risk by spending their time and effort more wisely. That comes from information. And Munish said a really interesting thing, security capacity, maturity, visibility. Helping people have really great actionable data that can help them make good decisions. Nobody should be chasing, exotic attacks when they don't have USB sticks under control. But, not everybody gets the message. Not everybody has the maturity in this industry to understand, even though so-and-so is telling me to protect from ROP attacks and upgrade my CPUs, I really should do an employee education campaign for phishing. That would be the biggest result. Helping people understand what's really happening, what tactics the criminals are using in the real world, and where their gaps are for best risk reduction. That's what the industry can help with. And I'll say again, risk. Businesses need to talk about the language of risk. If I go to a company and say, you should take out all the sprinklers, nobody would say that's a sensible thing to do. Why would we take out the sprinklers? If we have a fire, it solves all the problems. Okay, well, what about, don't upgrade your firewall? No, that's technobabble now. That's technology. I don't understand technology. We need to talk about risk. We need to talk about making good risk decisions, making decisions consciously, and remembering that not doing something deliberately is a legitimate business decision. There's many times in my career, customers said, I'm not going to upgrade my firewall. The effort to upgrade it, the risk in actually upgrading it is so high, I'll take the risk of using an out-of-date firewall. Conscious, deliberate decision based on metrics. Okay, that's okay. And if there is a problem and the firewall gets hacked, everyone could go back and say, we made a deliberate decision not to do this. We made a decision to accept the risks. There's no blame now. It's okay, how do we recover? That's the maturity of thought we want to install in everybody, small businesses and above, the maturity of thought to take conscious risk decisions, to not deal in a world of blame, and to focus on the things that give the biggest result. And I think that's something that big companies do well, that can help small companies understand and do well as well.
Alex,
I think, go ahead, please.
Yeah, Kiersten, I'm curious in your experience if you've seen small businesses start to shift and understand some of that basic risk decision making that Simon's talking about. The reason I'm saying it is because during the pandemic, at the beginning, but even over the course of the pandemic, everyone became a risk analyst. Everyone understood that they can either
Put on a mask.
avoid it. That was the big thing, that it was like shut down Broadway. They're like, what are you talking about? The show must go on. Like that was now an option of avoid it. And that would require a lot of resources. You could control for it, wear a mask, wash your hands. You could transfer it if, again, you had the resources, you had someone who could deliver groceries or have food delivered to your house, but you needed resources to be able to do that. And fundamentally, and really importantly, to Simon's point, if you didn't do any of those three, you were accepted. And I've seen that maturity with some organizations if that connection is made. And I'm curious, Kiersten, from your perspective with small businesses, they've lived through this really tough moment and they've made some risk decisions.
Munish, it's a great question. And, I would say, unfortunately, what we're seeing is that crisis response is not translating to business models of risk management. And it's not because they're not smart about it. It's not because they don't know that it's out there, but they often don't know what they are, to an earlier point that was made, what they're making trade-offs between. And this is where that very prescriptive approach to help them understand what are they doing, how to do it. We just had a larger member meeting for CRI. And one of the points that came up, we talk about in preparing for a breach in an event, prioritize your assets, inventory your assets, understand those functions that are critical to you operating. And we had one of our members say, how are you going to keep the cash flowing? That, we need to be more prescriptive to say, we're not going to give you these broad strategic questions to ask yourself. We should actually be telling you what some of those questions and answers should be. And while they've gone through this, I think what we saw was very much of a crisis management response. What are the things I need to do to get through this moment? And it's not that they haven't learned from that, but when you look at cybersecurity, they're still asking all of these questions. And unfortunately, they've only been exacerbated by the threats over the last 6 to 12 months in that, how am I going to prevent ransomware? I mean, there's still not enough clear information about what to do to prevent ransomware. And we've created tools to try to help do this, but it's not so much, the backup is there, but it's how do you access your network? And that goes to strong authentication. It goes to privileged access, making sure that employees that leave no longer have access. We were working with a large manufacturing company in the UK, and they were getting hammered by ransomware. And what they identified was that literally they had 32,000 employees that had privileged access. And when they went in to decipher that, they were actually able to reduce that to 696. That is not an exaggeration. It's a large company. And I think you see the big companies struggling with that. And then you can only just assume that the small businesses are continuing to learn all of these lessons, which is why, I think being able to create a one-stop shop for state and local governments and small businesses on the basics, helping them understand what the threat looks like, but importantly, what they need to do. And to an earlier point, Munish, that I think you made, they do need to understand the why, because they need to understand the context. We used to just say, they just need to know the how, they don't need to understand the why. But what we're finding is, as I mentioned, software updates are a great example. If you explain what that is in layman's terms, then everyone's like, well, of course I'm going to do that. And then, making all of those analogies to safety and security, whether it's seatbelts and airbags, brushing your teeth, choose your hygiene analogy, but it's out there. And I think that's one of the key elements in all of this is trying to distill this in a way where small businesses can access it. Because again, a long answer to a short question to answer your original point, we're not seeing the impact, I think, that one would hope from this, the last 12 to 18 months.
Kiersten, I think you just hit a point on the why. That's also very inherently human. Humans want to know why, whether you're a small child asking, why did you tell me no? I don't like the answer to be just because I said no. That's not the greatest one, but it's a human piece. And to your point on the human element of cybersecurity and where we continue to have deficiencies and the challenges and the capacity there. And to Munish's piece around enabling agency and trust in capabilities of individuals and to empower them to make decisions and also to build that capability out. It's often one of the most challenging areas to build that culture out. I think we've often focused in on purely the financial loss or the potential damage. I want to harken back to a point that Munish made, particularly around trust and user trust, whether, again, it's that small business, whether it's a major business, whether it's a city. This is fundamentally what we're all talking about, and empowering and enabling that in our digital ecosystem is especially important today. I think to your piece a moment ago on supply chains and where Simon referenced about third-party risk is especially interesting as we think about bringing small businesses back online and some of the challenges that we face. Would be especially interesting to hear you think about how the one-stop shop concept could potentially play out and how we build baseline standards to enable both that trust in businesses, but also to make it easier and accessible, because far too often cybersecurity feels unapproachable.
It does, and to look at the one-stop shop, we've got a lot of organizations out there that are doing good work. Munish mentioned the Global Cyber Alliance, other nonprofits, obviously CRI, the Center for Internet Security. There's so many that are working on different components of this problem and this issue. And when you look at also what the government is doing, there's an opportunity to curate these resources, vet them, and have the ability to, for small businesses when something happens, to go, but then also when they're looking at prevention, that they have the ability to access this. And I think when we look at resilience, this is very much where we should be collaborating. And to the earlier point around, we shouldn't be fighting attacks on our own. It's also why reporting has become so controversial, because it's seen as a competitive piece. And to Simon's point, I think Mastercard from the beginning has always been the leader and recognizing that cybersecurity should not be an advantage. And I would, the analogy I would also make is that as a vendor, you should not charge extra for secure software. I mean, there are basics in our infrastructure that we have to invest in to be a better society, whether it is a city or a state or a national government. And being able to look at this more collaboratively, I think will allow us to understand the threats, to understand the tactics, the techniques, and the procedures that are used by adversaries, but importantly, how everyone is responding. I'll make another point. The challenge that I immediately saw with Colonial Pipeline was, there were lots of challenges there, but initially it was them holding that event close to the chest, because if we're looking at our infrastructure and if we're looking at this at a city level, if you see an attack on an infrastructure, you want to share the TTPs that are being used, the tactics, so that other companies and small businesses can have that warning to be able to be resilient and to protect against. And that's why, to the extent that we can collaborate more, and I think the additional resources that are going to the cybersecurity and infrastructure security agencies to work with state and local governments, there are opportunities ahead. It's obviously not going to be easy, but that there is an investment in looking at this together. The National Cyber Director, Chris Inglis, has a phrase that he's used internationally, which is, if you're going to in order to beat one of us, you have to beat all of us. I'd like to see that analogy happen to us domestically, that cities, state and local governments, everyone is not out there on their own, that we see this more as a collaborative effort for resilience, for information sharing, and for increasing and improving our cyber defenses.
I think that's, I'm sorry, did I interrupt someone?
No, go ahead, Alex. I had a question, I thought, but please go ahead.
So I want to put a provocative point forward in both agreeing and disagreeing with that cybersecurity shouldn't be a competitive advantage. Holding back cybersecurity resources should not be a competitive advantage, in my opinion. But I also think that encouraging businesses and cities to compete and to differentiate themselves around the cybersecurity resources that they provide should actually become a competitive advantage. And I hope that we reach a point in which that actually becomes an enabler of both business decisions as well as infrastructure decisions for businesses, cities, states, and beyond.
And I do just want to add, I know Munish, you want to make one point, because it's a very important, particularly for small businesses. It's something that we talk about a lot, which is cybersecurity can be a differentiator for you. If you identify yourself as a company that has invested in doing the basics, and we're looking at a certification for our program at the Cyber Readiness Institute, but choose whatever journey it is. But I absolutely agree, Alex, that we can create the incentives to say, if you invest in this, you will have a return based on the business that you can create, because supply chain owners will look at you and say, I am much more willing to work with a company that's done the basics than otherwise. So there's no question. And I think it's a very important point, particularly when we're talking about small businesses and state and local governments.
Alex, I wanted to bring into this, or rather reframe some of the things we're talking about, back to a question to you, Simon, and to you, Kiersten. Alex, you as well, please. So Kiersten, you mentioned that organizations, when they've been breached or compromised, would want to share, or should want to share that. And I think a lot about the role of emotion in the response in security generally. There's two components: role of empathy and particularly emotion and security. We've talked about fear and how cyber criminals and adversaries use fear. And fear is a good way to avoid a behavior, but it's not a good way to sustain a behavior. You can tell me that to avoid a heart attack, I need to go to the gym, but I need to keep going to the gym, right? I personally, Munish needs to keep going to the gym. But like, to sustain that, there has to be some motivation behind it. And when there's a breach or a compromise, the first emotional human response is often shame, right? Like, there is that they've done something wrong and that it's all their fault and they don't want to share with others. So my question is about, if we're going to change, and you've talked about changing human behavior, and I really agree with that, change, whether it's technical, operational, or behavioral, has to be sustained by the culture. So how do you change the culture? Because if we can talk about cybersecurity, fraud, counterintelligence, it doesn't matter. Diversity, equity, inclusion, same thing. Change the culture. So how do you change a culture? This is sort of specific to cities, but I think applies to all organizations. I'd love to hear from both of you how you think about that.
So Munish, this is something we focus a lot on, obviously, because it's the core of what we're putting forth as saying this will make a difference in cybersecurity. And the first piece is, obviously you have to have buy-in across the company, but it's got to come from the leadership. And the leadership has to understand what that cultural change needs to be, and it has to prioritize cybersecurity. And there are different ways to do that have been demonstrated. It's everything from communications on a regular basis that remind employees that this is a priority. Onboarding has been identified as the most ripe time for cultural change. If you bring on employees and explain what their responsibilities are, but importantly, what the company is grounded in, then that onboarding experience can start. It's a longer term effort, but the more employees and the turnover you have, the quicker that cultural change happens. And then it's that constant communication and reminder, because to your point, it's about how do you sustain that? And there are different ways. There are incentives for good behavior. There's all sorts of controversy about penalties and consequences for bad behavior. But I do think we are at a point where if somebody is consistently negligent when it comes to cybersecurity, that you have to take appropriate action. But looking at the incentive piece, it's putting cybersecurity into position descriptions, which means that they get incentives and positive incentives, whether it's financial or otherwise, for continuously passing phishing tests and all of these other pieces. So that cultural change on human behavior, and I love what you were saying about empathy and emotion and fear, because these are at the core of what happens in cybersecurity. And we can't, when we talk about it as a technical problem, quite frankly, when we're talking about small businesses and cities and governments, I think it's almost, the technical piece is sort of the end. If you've gotten to that point, you've missed the foundation. And being able to create those cultures and just having that part of the communication, the reward system, the onboarding, the efforts, and having every leader take that on themselves and truly lead by example.
So I would agree with everything, obviously. And I would tell every business owner that don't be disheartened, but you cannot solve every problem. You cannot reduce the risk to zero, because at the end of the day, I'll just give one of your employees $10,000 for their password. So one of the important things to think about is when you suffer some cyber attack, how do you intend to react? And what are you going to tell your stakeholders, which is the board, your customers, the press? How are you going to enunciate the steps you took to reduce the risk? Are you going to say, well, we didn't do anything and we don't know? Or are you going to say, these are the programs we have in place that we believe was reducing our risk, and this is how we train our employees and protect our systems? How are you going to defend yourself without making excuses? But how are you going to show your customers that you took due diligence, you took this problem seriously, and you acted accordingly? And how big that story is very different for Ron Green, the CISO of Mastercard, versus the guy with the restaurant. Very different level of stories and different expectation in the customer base. But you don't want to be blind when the issue happens. So telling the story requires you to have information. So how are you getting the information needing to justify that? And I tell the people in my network, any cybersecurity product, ask the vendor, how do you measure success? How do I measure how effective the product is, how well it's deployed? How do I have a little chart that tells me my investment with you to protect me is useful? If you have that basic information, and Kiersten, you had a great example, we eliminated 30,000 potential compromises of administration accounts. That's a great story your customer has now. It's a material thing, it's measurable. Even small businesses, even if you're just buying antivirus, we have 100% of our computers protected with antivirus. That's a very powerful statement. Most companies can't make that. So I would encourage people, track the data, get your vendors to help you, make it the vendor's problem to tell you how effective their product is, build that story about why you are making a sensible, deliberate decision regarding your cyber risk, be armed with that, and of course, aspire to constantly reduce that risk, constantly bring it down step by step by step.
I do just want to add one point to what Simon said, because I think you've hit on some of the key issues that are often second degree, but I think are so important. When you talk to businesses, it's that inventory of what are you doing? So when an attack happens, you can come out to say, these are the decisions we made to be resilient. These are the risk management decisions, and this is why we did it. Because that scenario planning is so important to understanding how you're going to respond and what you need to do. The other piece, which is a lot harder for small businesses to hear, as well as cities, is that it's often not what you prevent, but it's how you respond when something happens. So it's very much thinking through what is your resilience and how do you minimize the disruption to operations? How do you get operations up and running quickly? And then the third piece is recovery, which isn't something we talk a lot about. And it's sort of, the analogy to physical disasters. A hurricane, we'll see it on the front page of the paper. We'll see, all of the resources that are going there immediately. But when you check in on that region 3 months, 6 months, 12 months, you see the devastation and the lack of recovery. So when we're working with small businesses and cities, particularly with limited resources, we have to be thinking about how do we help them recover? What is going to be required to get them back online? So that statistic about, 2/3 of small businesses that are breached go out of business, that we do more work to invest in keeping them viable after a breach.
And recovery is, one of the things we can give people is patience. Like Colonial. One thing we often lack is the empathy to give people patience. And if you think about the classic attack, which of Target many years ago, Target, if they did anything, they did an amazing job at communicating their progression and plan and refinement and reduction in risk over a great deal of time. And I think that patience that the buying public gave them was well rewarded. They're a viable, strong company, but they communicated and asked for patience and were given it and recovered well.
Yeah, I think to wrap us up, I think collectively you've each hit on a particularly salient point that focuses us in on the capabilities and trust and the capacity to be in this together. This is a collective defense, a collective capability, and a collective need, and bringing together like-minded cities, businesses, and communities of individuals to attack this threat head on and to be better and more resilient is the fundamental capability that we're focused on with City Possible. And I think the three individuals with Simon, Munish and Kiersten have each spoken about their resources and the needs and the capabilities that we hope each individual, each city, and each business begins to take advantage of. With that, thank you for joining us today. I hope you each have a wonderful afternoon and look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks, Alex.
Thank you so much.